Castleconnan became more exposed after the Shannon Scheme, then the shallows in Plassey and Corbally must also have become more exposed. These shallows were treated in Castleconnan by very experienced river people, anglers and so forth, but the shallows in Plassey or the shallows in Corbally received no attention. So how significant are these shallows and these deeps? I have marked the shallows like that, and these are the deeps, and this is the deep from Rabogue up to Plassey Bridge, and this is the deep from the cut to the Bushhole, and the deep from the gap of the dam to Partine. Now the physical makeup of a river, the mechanics of a river, play a very significant role in angling returns. And for instance, if say for instance you have a late run of grilse, that the grilse in other words don't arrive say in the longshore until the second week in June. Now it's more than likely that the larger percentage of these grilse will hold in the deep and the longshore and indeed the tailrace, because by that stage the river has become fairly weedy, fairly warm, oxygen less and so forth, and the fish take refuge here in the tailrace. Now I remember one year in the mid-70s, and for some strange reason the fish held in the deep from Rabogue to Plassey Bridge, and you'd ask yourself, why did they decide to hold in this particular deep? I don't know. All I know is that they did decide to hold. Now there might have been some dramatic change in weather conditions when they started to hold, or maybe a dramatic drop in water levels, but one thing sure and certain, these fish were reluctant to run the shallows above Plassey Bridge, and as fresh fish come into this deep, they held along with the fish that were already holding. So you'd often find that if fish start to build up in the deep, they'll encourage other fish to hold as well. Of course, also it could be the opposite. Sometimes some fresh fish running might, on some occasions, shift fish that are holding in the deep. So these deeps play a very significant role. Now, if it was necessary to narrow the channel all up through Castleconnan fishery to get fish moving through the fishery, or to give them access, why wasn't the same attention given, as I said, to these shallows? Now for instance, the river above the Lax Weir, the original river width is still there, and the water is fragmented right across the original river width, even though you're dealing with a lesser volume of water today. So what was done in Castleconnan, they narrowed the channel to suit the reduced flow. And maybe if the channel was narrowed above the Lax Weir, it might achieve the same thing as narrowing the channel on the gravel down into the Bushhole and getting fish out of this deep. It might get fish out of the tailrace and longshore. Worth a try. But one thing is sure and certain, fish are reluctant to run shallows, and of course weather conditions are a factor. If you have freshes, there's a good chance that fish will run these shallows. It could be said also that an east wind is helpful. I remember living next door to an old net fisherman who operated a fishery between the Gap of the Dam and O'Brien's Bridge, and he was of the opinion, experienced, told him that when there was an east wind, the fish would run and you'd get fish in the deep above the Gap of the Dam. But the shallows in Plassey and the shallows in Corbally might be worth looking at and see how it would improve angling returns. For an interesting subject or an interesting development in 1993, in the season just gone, was we had high water in June, and fish that might normally have went into the tailrace and used the access of the fish pass Narn Crusher up to the lake instead travelled the old system, which means water is a very important factor on the old system. Now, it must be said also that this deep above Castleconnan fishery is very important to the fishery itself, because fish that might hold in this deep prior to the angling season or during the angling season, if conditions were favourable, might decide to hold in this deep rather than this deep. So it's very important for this fishery to have this deep from the Gap of the Den to Partine Weir. And we know also in 1993 the high water in June brought fish that normally might have held in this deep up to the deep overhead Castleconnan from the Gap of the Den to Partine. So these are very important factors in the physical makeup of a river, and indeed they can determine the angling returns, because you could have a good run of fish into the estuary, into the longshore, and it might never materialise as a good angling season because of weather factors and weather conditions and the time of the year the run is. Because definitely the earlier the run, the better your chances of the fish travelling the old system. The later your run is, the lesser your chances. I remember working with the fisheries protection staff, and we would monitor the movement of fish as they moved upriver, and indeed watching the weirs on the Mulcair and Ecotty and Ballyclough, you would find a situation that the Mulcair fish mightn't run the Mulcair, the bulk of them mightn't run the Mulcair until October, and the reason there again would be they would be waiting for proper conditions to bring them over these shallows. And indeed they're easily identified because the tail race fish or the estuary fish are darker, greyer in colour. So it wasn't unusual to see an excellent run of fish on the Mulcair in October. So there again, as I said, these shallows are a factor in the angling returns, and it's something that maybe our learned friends in the Shannon Management Committee might at some time take a look at.